Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SLSO Stories live event. If you're familiar with our Lunch and Learn series from last season, you're in the right place. We've broadened the scope of these conversations and put them under the new heading of Stories Live. These virtual events let us go deep with musicians and experts on a specific topic. I'm Tim Munro, I'm creative partner with the SLSO, and today we're taking a look inside the rich and exuberant and delicious world of Baroque music. We have such brilliant guests. We're going to start with conductor Nick McGegan and historical keyboardist Mark Shuldiner. And later on in the hour, we're going to talk with three SLSO musicians, principal violist Beth Guterman Chu, cellist Yin Xiong, and violist Andrew François. First, a housekeeping thing. Please do ask questions using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Set the message to both panelists and attendees. It's going to be an action-packed hour with amazing guests, but I'm for sure going to get audience questions along the way. Special thanks to the SLSO's 2021-2022 SLSO Stories live sponsor, Washington University Physicians. And I'm delighted to welcome our first guests, Nick McGegan and Mark Shuldiner. Nick's been a regular conductor at the SLSO for many years, and Mark is no stranger to the SLSO. He's joined us several occasions as a keyboardist. Welcome, Nick and Mark. Thank you for spending time with us this afternoon.
Great pleasure. Thanks.
Nick, this word Baroque seems to evoke so many different sorts of things. People might know the word associated with a Vivaldi concerto or a Bach keyboard work, but what is the kind of huge world that word encompasses?
Well, first of all, I think we could say it's not just music. It's also a period in art, painting particularly, which is not quite the same historical period as the musical period. The art period is a little earlier. If we think of Caravaggio, I guess would be at the front end of it, Bernini, the sculptor. But musically, it sort of begins, I suppose, with Monteverdi. And the quintessential Baroque form is opera. That's the thing that actually gets invented around 1600. And the Baroque period goes on till about 1750. That's basically the year that Bach died, after which the style changes a little bit. It becomes what's known as Rococo, and then we get into the full classical period with Haydn and Mozart. It means sort of over the top. I think that would be a nice way of putting it. Extravagance. Indeed, one of Vivaldi's concerto sets is actually called La Stravaganza, which means precisely that. This is music that takes risks. It's often quite ornate. You can see it in some of the buildings too. Often simple structure, so everyone knows where they are. But then there's all the frou-frou. There's all the acanthus leaves. There's the fancy stuff. If you remember a fake 18th century building, let's call it the front of the Supreme Court would be a good answer in Washington. You've got the classical portico, which is doing the structure, but then you've got all the frou-frou and the things saying what it's all about, often in Latin. So it's a mixture between clear structure and abundance of non-load bearing fun stuff.
Is that what drew you to this world? That kind of twin side, that like toggling between these different kind of approaches, or this kind of combination of clarity and over the topness?
I suppose a little bit. Yeah, I suppose as a Brit of an Irish Scottish family, I suppose the sensible bit of me I could say was English, and that would be the structure, and then the fun stuff is the Celtic side.
Oh, I love that. Mark, do you feel kinship with that sense of the clarity and the over the topness, and what drew you to this world to begin with?
Absolutely. One of the things that really drew me in was looking at Seconda Practic's 17th century music, Monteverdi in particular. It just started my journey with this repertoire. And actually, when I was younger, when I was a kid, I was 11, I played Bieber Battaglia, and that was one of the very first pieces I ever played on harpsichord, accompanying, playing continuo. And that, again, that over-the-topness, that just kind of verve for life and rhetorical communication, really, it drew me in, and it showed a really wide way of interpretation. There's a lot of ways this music can be played. And I think, just a brief search would, show you how many different kinds of recordings you have, even in the modern era, of this kind of repertoire. So, yes.
And your instrument, we kind of very much, as general listeners, very much associate with this era. Can you give us an introduction to the harpsichord? Like, when is it born? Why is it?
Sure.
Why does it weirdly pluck the string?
Yeah, no, I can absolutely do that. The first harpsichord, the first extant example we have is from about 1390. We don't know, but we do believe it was, at least a predecessor to it would have been built before then. So it actually has a very long history. I think its last recorded use was in an Italian opera house around 1809, playing recitative. It is a keyboard instrument, and it creates sound by plucking strings, as opposed to the piano where it hits it with hammers. This makes it a true string instrument as opposed to a percussion instrument like the piano would be. And it had a long history of development, starting really in Italy, and then it just took the entire, European continent by storm. And it really was used as in a variety of ways. It was used to accompany simple monody, and it was also used to accompany these fairly extravagant concerti and then sinfonias. And it did span the eras. It did move into the classical era. Mozart composed for a harpsichord. And at the same time, J.S. Bach was acquainted with the forte piano, which was coming out at that point, especially models, that were built by Silbermann, who was a very prominent organ primarily, but also clavichord and harpsichord builder of central Germany. And he was kind of a clever individual. He had his apprentices sign an agreement that said that they would not be able to set up their own shops within central Germany. So it's, yeah, it's the first kind of keyboard monopoly, I guess you could view it as.
I guess I don't think of the keyboard wars, but as the harpsichord is sort of waning and the piano is starting to make its appearance in its sort of early forms, are they antagonists? Are there fistfights on the streets?
Not necessarily antagonists. They were viewed as two different tools, which I think is really quite important distinction. The piano was capable of playing much softer and more sensitively than the harpsichord was. One of the natural products of having a plucked keyboard instrument is that you cannot control the dynamic. Whereas with a piano, having hammers, you could hit it softer or harder and have a difference in dynamic. So it was considered a more sensitive instrument in a lot of ways than the harpsichord, which is interesting coming from our modern lens of having this, massive Steinway, which can literally overpower an entire orchestra, and then viewing the harpsichord as the quiet one. So, things have changed drastically with the industrial era, but at the origin of it, I think they were viewed as compatriots and complementary, and, tools for different uses.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, speaking of tools with different uses, the orchestra obviously has the core of its repertoire, an orchestra like the SLSO in maybe the 19th century. But Nick, how does an orchestra have to sort of change its sound or style or world to begin to approach the music of an earlier era of the Baroque?
One of the things, of course, is that the instruments back in the 18th century were different, although you hear a lot of people will say, well, he's playing a Stradivarius violin. Well, he's only playing part of a Stradivarius, actually, because all these famous instruments string instruments from the 18th century were all modernized in the 19th century to make them louder, to make them more stable. The bow has gotten much heavier since the 18th century. So one of the things that I do with an orchestra is just say, just relax, play lightly. Some people actually like to use old bows because they play this music more easily. You're not having to carry extra poundage around in your hand. But a lot of it is just style. And as you said in your intro, I've been coming to the SLSO for many, many years. 35 to be precise. I first came to conduct Messiah there in 1986. Long time
Well, happy
ago.
35th.
Absolutely. Lorraine Hunt Lieberson was singing soprano in that performance. It was also actually the first time I conducted Messiah with a full orchestra, which was great fun. So good fun. But back to the plot. The orchestra is very well used to playing music from this period. I've been doing it there for years. And of course, they're all terrific musicians. Some people actually play Baroque violin, for example, on the quiet. A lot of us there play chamber music of the Bach period as well. So it's not strange repertoire, and increasingly less so. There's at least one concert a year when music from pre-1750 is done by the symphony, and they play it extremely well. Sometimes, of course, it's a warhorse like Messiah or Vivaldi's Seasons. Sometimes, as in this concert, it's less well-known repertoire by slightly less well-known composers. In this case, one of Sebastian Bach's kids.
Yes, and I'm excited to talk about that program. We'll get to that in a little bit, and we'll be able to speak with the SLSO musicians. But I wanted to touch on one of the points that you were making, which is that it seems like maybe you're implying actually that there is a more widespread ability to be flexible. Are you noticing, as over these past 3 or 4 decades, as you travel around, maybe particularly America, that there is a more familiarity with more flexibility in the way that people can approach different styles?
Oh, certainly. I remember going to a very famous orchestra in the US about 30 years ago, and I would
that shall remain nameless.
It shall remain nameless, but it's in Philadelphia. I would say, as I remember it, every single one of the string principals was close to 80, if not over it. Nowadays, when you go to an orchestra like that, a lot of the, nearly all the string principals are in their 30s, some in their 40s. And they've also had experience at Juilliard or Curtis of meeting people or playing themselves instruments from the 18th century. Certainly the amount of 18th century repertoire that is being played by other orchestras and that these musicians, younger musicians, are familiar with, is much greater than it ever was back in the 1960s and early 70s. So it's really meat and potatoes now to an average symphony player, unless you happen to play something like the trombone.
Right, which does have a tiny existence in that era, but probably not.
More in the 17th century and in Venice, I would say.
Yeah.
Mark, you mentioned before that, which I found super interesting, that the harpsichord is in some ways a member of the string family, just like an entire orchestra of plucked strings. You play this, I wonder if you can just talk broadly about this role that you play as member of the continuo group. Like, what does that mean? You're kind of at the core of this orchestra. Yeah, what is that role that you play?
Well, it's one that I love more than almost anything. For one thing, it allows you to participate in the fundamental guidance of the music making, and you get to have a unique position of dissemination of a conductor's intent. And that's where the large-scale chamber music kind of comes into play, when you take this vision and you embody it, you embody the musical vision, and you work with your colleagues to help create that. The harpsichord is, first a percussion instrument. Actually, it's the rhythmic guidance of the ensemble. Secondly, it's harmonic guidance, and then thirdly, it has a melodic intent, and that's where the real creativity comes in, when you're playing from a figured bass score and improvising everything except the bass line, which is what you're playing with your left hand with your cello and bass colleagues. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt if you were in the middle.
No, go ahead.
And what is written? Talk to me about what's written on the page, because it's not everything, right? This comes from an era where improvisation not everything was notated on the page.
Correct. And one of the main ways we could look at that is through the lens of basso continuo and figured bass. So what is written out in figured bass, you have a bass line, which is played with your left hand. And underneath that are numbers, which indicate interval above the bass, also inversion. So you'd see like 6 or 6/5, 9/7, those kinds of things. And that tells you what harmonic movement is going on around you. And with composers like J.S. Bach especially, it's a very, very interesting thing to see the figures, because you can literally track voice leading through them. So you have an idea of this kind of multi-part vocal leading that can be done if you're, kind of true to it and playing accurately. But then it also gives you a lot of freedom to improvise. It gives you freedom to improvise rhythmically as well. If things start to go a little astray, or disparate parts of the orchestra may start to move in ways that maybe they shouldn't, a little shimmy here and there, you can bring it back together pretty simply. And that can be done through, making noise on the harpsichord, but it can also be very effectively done by not making noise on the harpsichord. Having sudden silence from the dampers hitting the string is kind of a percussive effect that people really do pay attention to, even though it's subtle. So it's a wide range.
It's such a beautiful insight into just like such a varied role. And then what sort of relationship are you having with the directors then, with Nick? Nick, what's your kind of relationship with Mark and with when you work with continuo players like that?
Well, he's Mark, or any other continuo player, is a member of the bass section. In a period instrument orchestra, and probably in this one too, the harpsichord will be right in the middle, as close to the cellos and basses as possible, because the cello and bass part is the left-hand part. They're usually pretty much the same. Very occasionally, in something like Brandenburg 4, does Bach write a separate left-hand harpsichord part to the cello part, but normally they're the same. And so he's a member of the continuo section, member of the bass section, and also the ringo of the orchestra. It's part of the rhythm section, if you like. My job is largely in the preparation of the performance. That is to say, composers didn't write an awful lot in their scores. If you look at a score from the late 20th century, every note tells you whether it's going to be long, whether it's short, whether it's going to be loud, whether it's going to be soft, whether it's all that kind of stuff, whether the music's going to be getting louder or softer. Bach has very little of that, almost none sometimes. So my job is to prepare the parts for the orchestra with what I want in there, so they don't have to improvise. And then, of course, to balance it. One of the things that is very different from the 18th century compared to now is simply the size of the spaces in which the music is played. When you go back to, say, the palace in Curtin, where a lot of these Brandenburgs were performed, the main music room is about the size of the stage in Powell Hall. Of course, there's a lot more people around now than there were then, so we have bigger and bigger concert halls, and the orchestras have got much bigger. So we've got to do a performance with a fairly small group, but to make sense of it in the equivalent of a musical equivalent of Grand Central Station.
And what sort of compromises does that entail? Like, does that mean that you are playing differently than you would at that time? Does it mean, Mark, does that mean that the harpsichords themselves are just different instruments than they would have been in that era? Or do we all as listeners have to kind of like shift a little further forward in our seats and listen in closer?
Well, for the harpsichord, we are playing on modern replicas of instruments. So we do have the same stringing dimensions. We do have the same stringing dimensions that they had back in the day. What we don't have, though, is access to the same types of materials, which is, I think, a kind of a crucial point. These days, very, very difficult to source some of the old growth spruce that they were having back then, having ready access to. And it's a different kind of tonality that's involved in that. What I would say is that for large concert halls, there's a lot more sharpness to attack and then also overholding, so that you really open the instrument up to its maximum resonance. And, you know, you can help that way. But I would say it's fairly effective even in large concert halls like Symphony Center in Chicago and Powell Hall. I don't know, Nick, do you have a feeling about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you may have to play a little thicker.
Yes.
In the numbers of chords that you play. One of the things that I must say I don't really always approve of is people say, oh, we have to mic the harpsichord to make it heard. Yeah. And I think that generally does a disservice to the instrument, because a lot of the time it's not a solo instrument, and we don't have particular concertos in here. It would be like saying, well, we've got a cello concerto, we better mic the cello so that everybody hears it. But I like your point, Tim, that everyone should maybe just move a little closer. I think that is fine. But concert halls were pretty small in the 18th century. And I personally quite like being up close and personal with my Bach and not be 300 feet away using a periscope to try and see who's playing.
Well, so maybe that's a recommendation for those to get your seats close by. But also a wonderful sense that just like that warmth and intimacy can be replicated in a larger space. You know, that lovely sense that you draw us in with your kind of magnetic music making. Mark, you mentioned like that the old wood just literally isn't in existence anymore, old growth forests and such. It makes me think about just the translation of music from far away, from long ago to our very different era. What is the way that we as modern listeners connect to music from that time? Is it, Nick, does it seem distant? Does it seem, what is relevant about it now? Or does that not even matter?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I think that personal experience has a great deal to do with musical experience for an audience member. I think that what you're doing is you are opening yourself up as an audience to, you know, fully appreciate the emotional impact of this music. It has always been relevant because it reaches back to kind of the primal experiences that we have as people, love and loss and, you know, grief, those sorts of things. They all come into play. They've all been expressed through music. It's the same reason why we still read ancient myths. It's because it's a reflection of the human experience that we can take with us to the present day.
I totally agree with that. That's great. No, but one of the things is this music has great rhythm, great tunes. A lot of it is based on dance. You can tap your feet to it. And it was designed, when it was first written, to be approachable to the audience. A lot of these pieces only ever got one performance, so it better make its mark. These people weren't writing music for 100 years in the future. They didn't get any royalties for performances. It's designed to be liked at the first hearing. And, oh yes, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, but the carapace, if you like, the surface is very, very approachable. And that's one of the things that I really like about it. You don't have to have a PhD to understand it or to enjoy it. It speaks directly.
That's so joyful. That's so joyful. Thank you. Since we're going to be welcoming some musicians from the SLSO in a few minutes, I wanted to start to chat about the program in December. We have Papa and Son. We have JS and CPE. Nick, what were they pals? Do we know, was CPE just in awe of his dad? Was he rebellious? What is their relationship? The father and son Bach.
Well, of course, there are lots and lots of sons to choose from in Bach.
Can you how many children did he have?
He had at least 19 by several wives. And that, by the way, is not the record. Marin Marais had about that number, but he only had one wife. Poor thing. She was definitely a queen bee. She was at it all the time. The Bach children had various attitudes to their father. Partly, of course, it's depending on when they were born. The famous composers of that are Bach's children come in pairs. There's two who were born in 1710 and 1714. C.P. Bach is 1714. And then there's another set who are 20 years later, who would have practically regarded their elder brothers as parents. We've got Johann Christoph Friedrich and Johann, who was 1732, and John Christian, the English Bach as he's known, who's 1735, who's 21 years younger than Carl Philipp Emanuel. So Carl Philipp Emanuel had a very different relationship to his father than the younger crop, who hardly would have had, his dad would have been considered a pretty old man, and who went on then to write music that was a very different style. C.P. Bach was unusual in the children in that, for example, he was left-handed, so he couldn't play the violin. He got out as pretty fast from under the family aegis, but on the other hand, he spent a good deal of his teenage years copying out his father's music. It's one of the things you did as a child of Bach, was you were a free copyist. You were also a free organ pumper. If Bach, I think, sort of one of his kids was getting a bit chubby, he could say, "Oh, I think I'll practice some fugues for 3 hours, come down to the church and pump the organ."
So because obviously electricity didn't exist then, you had to manually pump air through the organ. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. It's a great way of slimming your kids down, and making sure that they don't get into trouble. Certainly, J.S. Bach was very proud of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, partly because he'd landed a pretty snazzy job as the main keyboard player to King Frederick the Great of Prussia, which was the sort of dream job that Johann Sebastian never quite got in terms of a court, working for a king rather than a mere duke or a princeling who didn't have much cash and a wife who didn't like music. So one of the things is that Bach actually went to visit Carl Philipp Emanuel in Berlin, and that's when he met the king, and the result was the musical offering. But certainly Carl Philipp Emanuel revered his father without imitating his style. Carl Philipp is very much on the cutting edge of Rococo music. It's also very eccentric, some of it. Sudden stops and starts. But it's also very deep. The slow movements are very, very heartfelt. C.P. Bach was also a brilliant improviser and keyboard player. He wrote loads and loads of keyboard concertos, many more than his father. But on the other hand, he was also a gourmet and seems to have enjoyed life rather a lot and inherited his father's picture collection.
He was also an...
Say that one more time, Mark.
He was also an attorney. He never practiced. He got a degree as an attorney.
That's fascinating.
And he's named for Telemann, who was his godfather. Which is another...
Just to cap that, interestingly enough, there's a play about Bach and his children going on in London right now, and the critic wrote how absolutely brilliant and well-researched it was when Johann Bach and his two children, Wilhelm and Karl, and that just shows you that he didn't know a damn thing, because Bach is Sebastian, Wilhelm Friedmann is Friedemann, and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach is Emmanuel. You go by your last name, and just to prove that, Bach's father, who was Johann as his first name, had 5 brothers also called Johann. So you can imagine at the breakfast table, if mother had said, "Please pass the marmalade," 6 kids, all with the same name, didn't know which one she was talking about. And interestingly, he's Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, as Mark said, because he is the godson of Georg Philipp Telemann. So these people don't go by their first names. That's usually the godfather's name, godparent's name. It's the personal one is right at the end.
Actually, someone in the chat just says, Josiah says that the Germans call it the Rufname.
That's right. Well, it's not only the Germans. I'm James Nicholas McGegan. First name is that of a member of the McGegan clan. My father was James, his grandfather, and way back.
Fascinating. That's awesome. So Mark, just before we let you go, I want to just like very quickly get your sense of your relationship to Bach's music. And maybe here we're talking about JS, but also if you have a particular relationship to CPE, Emmanuel Bach.
Well, one of the really great contributions that we haven't really yet touched on for CPE Bach was his treatise on keyboard playing. And I would say that, you know, especially when I was in conservatory and looking at treatises, it was definitely one of the most helpful bodies of work out there in collections regarding continuo playing and improvisation. He has a large section on the Fantasia. And it has always been a source of inspiration for me. I've always had, from my childhood, a very intimate relationship with J.S. Bach. And then as I got older and started playing CP Bach keyboard sonatas and things like that, it just kind of snowballs. And, you know, it gives you a lot to draw from as a person and as a musician.
Oh, I love that. That's beautiful. Well, thank you, Mark. We appreciate your time. It's been delightful. It would be so much fun to even dork out more about your work as a tuner and someone who actually works on harpsichords. I love that you are a tinkerer as well as a practicing musician.
Thank you.
So thanks so much, Mark.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
And Nick, as we transition into chatting with the SLSO musicians, I wonder if you can talk a bit about the relationship with an orchestra where you are able to have such sustained contact with musicians over a period of time.
Well, it's terrific. As I mentioned earlier, I've been coming for 35 years to the orchestra, and every year pretty much, and sometimes more than once, and not only doing music from the Baroque period, but often later when David Robertson was music director, he would always insist on having a piece of more modern music in there. So I would do maybe a Brandenburg and mix it up with a concerto grosso by Tippett or Martineau or someone like that, or Stravinsky, based on maybe 18th century forms, but speaking a 20th century language. And so, and I often see many of the musicians from the St. Louis Symphony in Aspen every summer. So I get to meet them every few months, which is absolutely delightful. Many of them have become really good friends over the years, and to come to do Baroque music with them is just the greatest treat, I have to say.
I love it. And it's a treat for all of us, particularly around the holiday season, where it just feels like it warms our heart on cold days. I am delighted to welcome three members of the SLSO, Beth Guterman Chu, Andrew François, and Yin Xiong, to talk with us. If you can turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves, let's see if we can make this magic happen. Hi!
Hello.
Andrew and Yin, thank you so much. I thought I would start just because we were just chatting about relationship as a musician, as a string player, maybe with Bach. Maybe Andrew, you first. Do you remember your first time playing a piece by J.S. Bach, and like what has that relationship been?
I think so. I am a late bloomer in terms of viola. I was a violinist before. I did my whole undergrad degree in violin performance, and then I switched to viola for my master's. So I believe the first Bach that I did was the D minor partita, which I think a lot of young violinists start on just because it lies well in the hand, it lies well in the ears, it has the chaconne, it's a full work of music. And so it really sort of tackles on all the technical difficulties that violinists usually work on. And I think I was maybe in 8th grade when I played it. And I just remember thinking, there were so many details and so many different ways you can express Bach, and without really tinkering with it too much. It's just phrasing, it's all in the bow. It's not too much vibrato or anything like that. It's just, I believe Beth and I talked about this, and it's just very pure music, but with so many different ways you can interpret it. And I just remember feeling so overwhelmed by it, just being like, I have no idea what I want to do. I hadn't studied music theory. I hadn't really studied Bach's music. And, as you get older and you study it more, the more insight you have into sort of the time period and the way that the music has historically been approached. Yeah, and so, but it was great. It was fun. I didn't know that I wasn't playing it so well, so that was okay. Yeah.
Well, it's so interesting. You talk about it almost like you have a relationship with a person over a life. This relationship with the music. Yin, do you feel that way? That somehow maybe Bach was a way that you could learn the instrument, but now it's a way that you communicate through the instrument? Or like, tell me about your relationship with old Sebastian.
Well, I first heard Bach cello suite was actually through my father, because both of my parents are all cellists. So I grew up listening to my dad practicing like every day. So I just remember like one time he played, I think it's number 3 suite, the Gigue. And I was like, whoa, like that's so pretty. And then a few days later, he played again. And I thought, okay, that's not the same piece I heard. And he later told me, you know, he was like taking a different tempo of the piece. And then he said, you know, like when you get into it, like Andrew said, there are so many ways to interpret the piece. And yeah, so that's my first impression of the Bach. And later when I started learning the cello, it gradually becomes actually the warm-up piece every time when I pick up the instrument. So I just randomly pick a movement from it based on what kind of mood I'm in of that day. Yeah.
Why is that? Why is it your warm-up instrument? Your warm-up music? Does it somehow make the cello resonate in a particular way? Does it somehow like make your brain work in a particular way? Like what is it about the music that makes it so perfect for that purpose?
I think when I listen, just listen to the Bach cello suite, it sounds sort of simple, not difficult, but when I actually play it somehow, well, sometimes I struggle with it, but sometimes I don't. It just depends on how my body feels on that day. So I think it's, for me, I think it's a good exercise for myself to just train both of my hands to just start with a piece of like the Bach. Yeah.
Right. And you and all the people who start their days with Bach or start their sessions with Bach are in very good company, because I gather Brahms said something like, I rinse my mouth with him every morning, which I love. Beth, you were talking to me actually during the pandemic. Hi, welcome.
Hi.
You were telling me during the pandemic that you were finding yourself going to Bach. Is there a relationship with Bach that maybe deepened during that difficult time, or like what has your general kind of relationship been?
Absolutely. When everything shut down, and for the first time in our lives, we had no next concerts to think about, that was 100% what I played 100% of the time. And I think it's because it's this real mix of universal music and also in some ways the most personal music, because everyone is going to play it a little bit different. But everybody feels it. And, you know, somebody who's listening or playing could be thinking this is the most hopeful music ever. Someone who's listening or playing it could be feeling this is just melancholy and reminds me of sadness of my youth. It's just this really special place. It's I don't know, maybe the best really word is universal, that what I just said earlier, but yeah, I mean, when I came to it during the pandemic, it just felt solid, like there was so little that I could hold on to, and this was still true. So yeah, it was very special.
I love that. Just like in a time where we have lost control, what is the one way that we can find control somehow? In the chat, Lauren writes that Chopin had his students practice Bach every day, and that many of Chopin's contemporaries declared just how attached he was to the works of Bach. Nick, since Beth mentions the dependableness or like the solidness of Bach. We almost didn't have the Brandenburg Concertos, from what I read. It took 100 years for them to come up. Nobody knew they existed. Can you tell that story a little bit?
Sure. I mean, what happens is with some of Bach, if we only knew Bach by music that had been printed, published in his lifetime, we'd know very, very little, because almost everything in Bach survives as a manuscript. And so with the case of the Brandenburgs, now let's just backtrack and say that the Brandenburg Concertos were already written with no intention of them being bundled up together in a book and sent to the Marquis of Brandenburg. These are pieces that he had in his cupboard, as it were. Maybe it's a job application to the Marquis of Brandenburg. And essentially, music in the 18th century was bundled up rather like eggs and bagels into dozens and half dozens. So you have 6 concertos or 12 concertos. That's the publishing thing. In this case, he's sending six of the best, if you like, marketing them, wrapping them up in a beautiful manuscript written in French and dated, funnily enough, 1721. So the year of the actual manuscript is 300 years ago this year, which is very nice. So very good reason for playing them. It's March the 24th, which actually is Telemann's birthday. I don't know if that's a significance. But there's no actual evidence that the Marquis of Brandenburg ever actually opened the score. There were no parts with the score. It's a presentation score, very beautifully written out by Bach himself. The kids ruled the manuscript paper. That's what they did. But Bach himself actually wrote the notes. He's also very careful if he's made a mistake of rubbing it out and correcting it so you can't really tell. It's a presentation score. And the Marquis died sometime in the 1730s. The manuscript languished, and it wasn't really opened until the 1850s. Bach's reputation, not amongst other composers, but amongst the general public, completely waned during the second half of the 18th century. If you'd mentioned to somebody the name Bach in the end of the 18th century, they probably would have been thinking you were either talking about Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach or John Christian Bach rather than Papa. And then it isn't until the Mendelssohns come along that J.S. Bach is rehabilitated, partly, in fact, because Mendelssohn's great aunts were students of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and Wilhelm Friedmann. And indeed, Carl Philipp Emanuel wrote a concerto for 2 of them. Fanny and Cecilia, I think their names were. And so it's Mendelssohn who helped with the Bach revival, but even the Brandenburgs then were not part of that. He was reviving mostly the sacred works, the Matthew Passion, and the keyboard works, such as the 48 Preludes and Fugues, which were widely admired by Beethoven, Mozart. They all just loved that kind of stuff. And it's important to remember that a lot of this music, you were talking about, students playing this and stuff and warming up on this. Some of that's intentional. They're called, Chopin called his works studies, études. You have preludes. This is, ones in the 17th century were called preludes to stretch your hand. It's what you warmed up on before you played the main piece to get your fingers going. And of course, they didn't have such good heat in those days, so maybe you did really need to warm them up. And we have to remember that a lot of this music for solo instruments, that's for solo keyboard, for solo cello, solo violin, it's meant for the delight of the player, not for an audience. And so it is literally to please the person playing it.
That's fascinating.
I think that's true of most chamber music in the 18th century, certainly chamber music before 1780s, 90s, when Haydn writes some of the first string quartets to be performed in public. What happened was rich amateurs commissioned Haydn and Bach and other people to write chamber music for their enjoyment, and the audience are eavesdropping on the performance. It's not for them. They're just lucky to be there. It's designed to please the players. Orchestra music, on the other hand, is very different. That is poor people playing for rich sponsors. Indeed,
Well, I mean,
they had to stand up. They weren't allowed to sit down unless they were a cellist. It's considered rude to sit in the presence of your betters.
That's why players stood up, because
the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra in Leipzig did not play seated till the 1880s.
Wow. Nick, you are a veritable font of just the most brilliant little tidbits. It's just incredible.
I'm very old, that's why. Just kidding.
But so because you mentioned the joy of the musicians themselves, for the joy of the musicians playing them, I do want to touch on our three wonderful musicians who all are taking solo roles in December's performances. And Andrew and Beth, it seems like to me that I in the Baroque period, I hear concertos for lots of different instruments and combinations of instruments, but two violas seems like a bit of a weirdsie. Beth, do you know of any other works with solo viola parts, such like as ornate as the Brandenburg Sixth Concerto?
Two violas together? No, I do not. For sure not. Mozart wrote his Sinfonia Concertante, but that's one violin and one viola, and it is just, okay, so my first experience other than Suzuki playing Bach was I got asked to be in like a pickup group in someone's living room of Brandenburg 4 with that unbelievable piano or harpsichord part, and it just blew my mind. I had never heard anything like it, and it felt like rock and roll. But to have these lower voices together is just so cool. And it almost feels like the original John Adams or something, where you don't know whether you're near the beginning or the end, and it just keeps going and going. And I know a lot of people who are not even musicians themselves, Brandenburg 6 is their favorite. But I think it's not widely enough played. And I just don't know why. I don't know, Andrew, can you think of any others that have two violas?
I know I've played maybe arrangements of like Telemann duos, but I think maybe they were originally written for viola da gamba or violins, and then transcribed for viola. But originally written for viola, no, I can't off the top of my head think of anything.
And Andrew, it seems like that the piece is just this crazy conversation between the two of you. What is that interplay like? Have you played the work before, and what's that interplay feel like?
So this is my first time performing the work. Very excited about it. Thank you, Beth, for asking me to do it.
Never know. He's such a natural. It's amazing.
But recently we played it together just to sort of figure out some of what we wanted to do, and it sounded amazing. Of course, Beth is great to play with and easy to follow, but just the opportunity to just sort of let go and play with each other and move with each other and phrase with each other, sort of get into each other's sound is really rare for two violas to get to do in a solo capacity, like we're getting to do with this. I don't know. It's just really exciting to be able to do that. I've played pretty much all the other Brandenburg concertos except this one, so it's time to round off my my six.
Well, and this one feels like such an intimate conversation. Maybe the others have like a larger canvas somehow. I don't know why that strikes me as feeling more intimate.
For sure. I mean, there are certainly fewer people on stage. There's not like a huge tutti orchestra. Not that any of them are huge, but there are really probably only 6 other people other than the two of us. And also this one just really, I know what I was saying before about you don't know what it feels like, but this one just radiates joy almost from beginning to end. It does feel sort of like a gentle party or something. I don't know. It's just
Is that your sort of party? Do you like gentle parties or wild parties?
I don't know.
Gentle party will be at your place.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you get it all in this one. The first and last movement are sort of the raucous parts. The middle is like the nice evening outside, taking a break from the inside.
Yeah, a little stroll from the craziness.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Well, you're both. Yeah, Nick, sorry. Go on.
There's one thing that's important here, that many composers loved playing the viola themselves. That was Mozart loved playing the viola. Bach certainly played the viola. He loved it. You're right in the middle of the texture. And so, although Brandenburg 5 is the one with the flashy harpsichord part, that's Bach showing off. Here we're getting Bach, and I'm sure he must have played one of those viola parts because those orchestras were tiny, and there wasn't as if there was a large viola gene pool to choose from. Um, um, it's a very personal piece, and I'm sure he loved playing it. And he played string instruments extremely well. Played everything probably. It's a wonderful, but it's also contrasted with something we won't get in these performances, which are the violas da gamba. Viola da braccio, the name should be. It's the viola under the arm, as opposed to the viola between your knees. And the viola da gamba was actually played by the Prince of Anhalt-Köthen in the palace where Bach was living. And the other thing that's interesting about the gamba is it's the only... Ladies did not play the cello in the 18th century, but they could play the gamba.
Huh.
And did, partly because the daughter of the King of France did. So it's an aristocratic instrument. The viola, perhaps less so, but it's the violas da braccio who win in this one. The gambas play a very subsidiary role.
Well, and is it sort of a passing of the baton in some ways? Because the viola da gamba also an instrument maybe from an older era, almost like passing the baton.
Could be.
Yin, I wanted to get to you to talk about you are taking center stage for a big virtuoso concerto. Can you talk a little bit about your experience so far learning the C.P. Bach concerto and what are some of its challenges?
I actually, this is my first time playing C.P. Bach's piece. And during my last year at Juilliard, right before I joined the orchestra, I had to play a recital, and the A major C.P. Bach cello concerto was actually in my mind. But back then, I didn't have much time to just really sit down and learn this piece because it's technically a little bit challenge for me. But so now I think it's coincidence that I had the chance to really get into this piece and perform with my colleagues.
That's wonderful. What is particularly hard about it? You say that it's even a challenge today. I think my outside perspective feels a bit like music from that era maybe is not as challenging as later on. What makes it particularly challenging?
I think it's such a colorful piece, and it has a variety of expressions. And I feel like each movement creates its own story. So first movement, it's very joyful, that kind of feeling. And second movement, it's sensitive, a little bit unsettled and tenderness. And then last movement's exuberant, very virtuosic, and a big contrast to very emotional depth of the slow movement. So I think when I practice for it, just it's a little challenge for me to bring out character of each movement, I think, for me.
Oh, well, that's beautiful. I mean, it's lovely. Nick, were you going to say something? Sorry.
Well, it's a fascinating thing because C.P. Bach did not play the cello, but he manages to write very well for it. And this concerto also exists in a version for flute, which meant that the King of Prussia could have played it. And it's one of maybe 80 concertos by C.P. Bach, mostly for the keyboard. But there's 3 or 4 of these cello concertos, which I think are absolutely amongst the finest. This one has the advantage of being a little bit shorter than some of the others. And it's sort of slightly more distilled, shall we say, than some of the other concertos, which you might say wander a little more. So I'm really looking forward to hearing it. And I've done it. And I don't play the cello either, so I'm going to be in total admiration of you doing it. I've done the piece maybe 5 times and just love it. So, and it shows you in many ways that C.P. Bach is, to some extent, the link between the music of his father, what we think of as Baroque music, and music of the later 18th century. And of course, in cello terms, we're talking the Haydn concertos. which are equally wonderful, but speak a slightly different language. And the C.P. Bach is kind of in between. And he is the person who is the link between the first half of the 18th century and the second half.
How beautiful that we get this sort of two generations, one passing music on to the next and looking to the future. Well, what a delight to spend this time with you. I'm delighted to say that you will all be sharing the stage with one another in just a few short weeks. But for now, it's been wonderful to spend time with you all. Thank you, Nick, Mark, Beth, Andrew, and Yin for joining us. I want to thank the Stewart Family Foundation and Washington University physicians for their support, and thank you for joining us with comments and questions. Just a quick note about some other SLSO goings on, and just to mention the concert that we've been talking about this evening. Please join us December 3 to 5 as Nick McGegan conducts a program of music by J.S. Bach and his son C.P.E. Bach, including Beth Guterman Chu, Yin Xiong, and Andrew François as soloists. For information on these concerts, please visit slso.org and mark your calendars for the next Stories Live event on Thursday, December 16, where we're going to talk about movie music. Check your email inbox in the next week or two for an invitation with details. Now, let's do the Zoom thing, friends, and say bye-bye. Bye.
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 Bye.